No one in the quiet town of Ashwood Hollow could have imagined that the most charming eyes ever seen on television would conceal a dark, ancient secret. Lila Hawthorne, a little girl with a smile that could light up an entire room, was destined to become a star. Yet beneath that seemingly perfect innocence, something far older and far more sinister stirred. Ashwood Hollow was the sort of town that seemed frozen in time. Its cobblestone streets twisted like veins through rows of weathered, colonial-style houses. The central square featured an old bandstand, its wooden boards warped and cracked, groaning under the weight of every wind gust. The townsfolk all knew each other, yet despite this familiarity, whispers of past tragedies lingered in corners, unspoken but ever present. The air carried a subtle heaviness, a quiet warning that something was not quite right. Lila was the only child of Eleanor Hawthorne, a delicate woman with a frail constitution, and Jonathan Hawthorne, a man whose origins were shrouded in mystery. Jonathan disappeared early in Lila's life, vanishing into the surrounding forests. Some claimed he had fled in madness, others whispered that he had been claimed by the woods themselves. Eleanor remained, haunted and worn, carrying a silent burden that weighed her down in every movement. From her earliest years, Lila drew attention. Her eyes were deep chestnut, almost black in certain lights, and they held a strange, hypnotic quality, as if they could draw the gaze of anyone who met them into their depths. Even as a toddler, she would hum strange melodies in the empty streets, her voice sweet, yet carrying a haunting undertone that left adults uneasy. By age 6, Lila began performing at local gatherings, church events, and school recitals. Her voice, ethereal, crystalline, yet tinged with an inexplicable melancholy, had the power to move entire audiences to tears. One evening, during a performance in the town hall, a young teacher noticed something unsettling. Shadows along the walls seemed to stretch unnaturally toward her, bending and twisting in rhythm with her song. When she blinked, the shadows vanished, but the chill remained. It wasn't long before a visiting television producer, Marcus Whitfield, noticed her talent. He called her a raw diamond, as someone capable of enchanting viewers across the nation. Soon, the sleepy streets of Ashwood Hollow became a gateway for Lila's rise to stardom. Lights, cameras, and applause replaced the quiet murmurs of the town, yet a sense of unease lingered. Not all were pleased by her ascent. Elderly residents whispered in hushed tones that the girl was marked. Strange phenomena were reported during her performances, objects moving without contact, shadows passing where no one stood, mirrors reflecting images that weren't there. Mrs. Abernathy, a seamstress, swore she saw Lila's reflection turn to look at her, even though the girl's back was turned, smiling in a way that made the hair on her neck rise. Most disturbing of all were her eyes. Those who met Lila's gaze for too long felt a creeping chill, as though something unseen was examining the deepest corners of their souls. Children avoided her company, yet even those frightened were compelled to watch her perform. Her innocence seemed like a carefully constructed mask. Behind the sweet smile and angelic voice, something ancient and powerful lingered. As the months passed, rumors began to spread. On nights when the moon was full, townsfolk claimed to hear her singing in the deserted square, the melody haunting, unintelligible, and filled with notes that made dogs howl and flee. Some swore they saw her conversing in a language no one understood, speaking to invisible companions before stepping onto any stage. Eleanor, increasingly worn down, rarely ventured outdoors. Neighbors reported hearing her soft sobs well into the night, accompanied occasionally by muffled screams, as if she were struggling to contain nightmares that refused to end at dawn. When questioned, she would only mutter that Lila had a gift, yet her tear-streaked face betrayed the truth. The gift was also a curse. Marcus Whitfield ignored the town's warnings. He whisked Lila into increasingly prominent television appearances. With every appearance, her fame grew, and Ashwood Hollow seemed to shrink under an invisible weight. Accidents began to occur. A carpenter fell from scaffolding while setting up her stage. A reporter suffered a sudden breakdown, claiming that Lila's eyes had swallowed her mind. None of this reached the national media. To the wider public, Lila Hawthorne was a delightful child star adored by millions. But those in Ashwood Hollow knew the truth: this child carried something that was not of this world. And deep down, everyone sensed that one day, the mask of innocence would fall, revealing the curse that had existed long before her birth. Lila's rise to national prominence was swift and seemingly unstoppable. Every audition, every television appearance, every small recital she attended seemed orchestrated by invisible hands. From her first local performance to appearing on studio stages lit with dazzling lights, she captivated every audience without effort. Her smile, the clarity of her voice, and the magnetic pull of her presence made it impossible for anyone to look away. On television, Lila's image was carefully curated. She wore soft pastel dresses, ribbons in her hair, and was always presented as the angelic girl from Ashwood Hollow. Letters and gifts poured into studios in quantities unimaginable, sent from children who idolized her and parents who dreamed of a daughter like her. Yet there was something unsettling about Lila herself. While other children were nervous before the cameras, she remained eerily calm, almost detached, as if she had been performing all her life. Her gaze penetrated the audience, scanning each person individually, a depth in her eyes that made even seasoned producers uneasy. Crew members whispered about feeling drained after even a few minutes of filming, as if Lila's presence absorbed more than just attention. Murmurs began to spread among the studio staff. Lights flickered inexplicably when she was on set. Cameras shut off at random, and microphones picked up whispers no one could trace. Some technicians claimed that they could hear soft choruses of children singing along with her, yet there were no other children on the set. One stagehand swore he saw shadows twist unnaturally, elongating across walls and floors, moving toward her as if drawn to some unseen force. Despite these occurrences, Lila's career flourished. Within months, she appeared in commercials, television dramas, and recorded her first album. Critics were mesmerized. Her voice had a hypnotic quality. Listeners described an impossible mix of enchantment and unease, feeling simultaneously uplifted and constricted by her melodies. The public adored her. Yet Ashwood Hollow, the town that had birthed her, seemed to wither with every spotlight she graced. Shops closed mysteriously. Longtime residents died suddenly or disappeared without explanation. Even the once lively central square grew quiet, an oppressive emptiness taking hold. The older townsfolk whispered that Lila was drawing life from here to feed something far greater. Fans outside the town reported their own strange experiences. A teenager in Boston said that after repeatedly watching Lila's performances online, she began dreaming of the girl standing silently by her bed, singing in an unknown language. A young man in Chicago claimed that after listening to her debut album at night, faint, ghostly voices could be heard layering themselves over her songs, whispers of unseen children echoing alongside her melodies. None of these accounts reached mainstream media. To the world, Lila remained the darling child prodigy. Yet in quiet households, her presence caused insomnia, nightmares, and fits of inexplicable fear. Even off camera, Lila's behavior unsettled adults. She did not play with other children, rarely requested toys, and rarely laughed spontaneously. She would sit quietly in the studio, watching everyone with a depth of perception that made those around her feel exposed. One makeup artist, visibly shaken, recalled a session when Lila turned to him and said in a calm, unnervingly mature tone, "Do you know what it feels like when everything you love starts to vanish?" The artist had laughed nervously, unsure whether she was joking, but later admitted that the way she said it chilled him to the bone. He vowed never to work with her again. Eleanor Hawthorne became increasingly withdrawn, avoiding travel whenever possible. When she did appear, she whispered prayers in Latin, words she seemed to have memorized from an unknown source. Some believed she was attempting to protect her daughter, others feared she was trying to contain the darkness Lila carried. Meanwhile, Lila's fame soared like a meteor across the country. With every performance, every interview, every televised song, her aura seemed to draw more energy from the world, leaving subtle tremors of unease behind. Loved, admired, and celebrated by millions, yet those who truly observed her sensed an underlying dread. The older residents of Ashwood Hollow began recalling an old legend that a child born with unusually dark, hypnotic eyes could be both a blessing and a curse, carrying within her a force that existed before the town itself, a shadow that one day would demand its due. And although Lila herself remained unaware of these whispers, her very existence confirmed them. Something ancient stirred within her gaze, within her voice, within every small gesture. Ashwood Hollow, once a sleepy town, had become a place where innocence and darkness intertwined. No one could yet comprehend the scale of what was coming. By the time Lila turned 10, her fame had reached a global scale. Television appearances, concerts, and magazine features became a relentless rhythm in her life, yet the world beyond Ashwood Hollow seemed to bend subtly under her presence. In her absence, the town's atmosphere thickened with unease. Animals acted strangely, pets disappeared without explanation, and faint, haunting melodies echoed through empty streets late at night. Windows shattered for no reason, and lights flickered unpredictably in abandoned homes. Locals whispered that the girl's growing power seemed to be stretching outward, touching every corner of the town. Inside the studios, crew members described an energy unlike any other. Floors vibrated faintly during her performances, the air seemed heavier, and a faint, almost imperceptible whispering followed her from room to room. One cameraman, whose hands shook as he recounted the story, claimed that when filming a close-up of her singing, he felt as though unseen hands were pressing against his chest, forcing him to maintain eye contact with Lila. Even her closest co-stars were affected. During a rehearsal for a televised musical, a fellow child actor fainted mid-scene, whispering afterward that Lila's eyes had looked into his soul and seen things no one should ever know. A makeup artist, preparing Lila for a performance, later reported that the girl had studied him silently for several minutes, then asked, in a voice far too mature for a child, "Do you believe in the things that hide when no one is watching?" He left the studio immediately, his hands trembling, swearing never to return. Despite these unnerving incidents, Lila's career continued to soar. Record deals, television contracts, and national tours multiplied. Critics described her voice as a hypnotic force. Some felt as though listening to her songs was like surrendering a small piece of themselves. Her presence seemed to demand attention, bending the will of those around her with an almost supernatural intensity. Meanwhile, Ashwood Hollow decayed quietly in her absence. Shops that had stood for decades closed suddenly, longtime residents fell ill or vanished without trace, and the central square grew eerily empty. The older townsfolk whispered of an ancient curse, saying that the girl was feeding something unseen, a force older than memory itself. Even the town's animals avoided her old home, and the wind seemed to carry a subtle, mournful wail whenever she returned. Within the world of fame, Lila's image remained pristine. She was angelic, perfect, a prodigy adored by millions. Fans wrote letters professing admiration, journalists praised her composure, and television producers marveled at her professionalism. But behind the smiles and applause, subtle cracks appeared. Stage lights would dim inexplicably during her solos, microphones would pick up ghostly whispers, and shadows shifted unnaturally across studio walls. Late at night, Margaret Hawthorne, exhausted and fearful, tried to contain the phenomena around her daughter. She whispered ancient prayers in Latin, locked doors, and attempted to shield Lila from unseen forces she could not fully comprehend. Yet the girl's presence seemed to override every barrier. Objects shifted of their own accord, distant laughter filled empty rooms, and even Margaret herself felt the oppressive weight of something staring at her from beyond the physical world. Fans began reporting strange experiences. One teenager in New York wrote about waking from dreams to find Lila standing silently at the foot of her bed, singing in a language she could not understand. A family in Atlanta claimed that recordings of her songs played backward revealed faint, eerie voices that were not part of the original performance. These stories were dismissed publicly, but privately, they spread among those who dared to observe too closely. Even among those who adored her, a subtle unease lingered. Lila was a child prodigy, yes, but the intensity of her presence hinted at something ancient and malevolent beneath the surface. The whispers of Ashwood Hollow, tales of a child who carried a shadow older than the town itself, now seemed plausible, and those who remembered the early days of her life saw the signs that had been there all along: the unnatural calm, the piercing gaze, the songs that moved hearts in ways they could not explain. No one, not even Lila herself, understood the full extent of what was unfolding. But the pattern was clear: Innocence, so perfect and untainted, had become a vessel for something far darker. And as the world celebrated her, Ashwood Hollow held its breath, waiting for the inevitable revelation that the angelic mask would one day fall, exposing the ancient malice within. By the time Lila reached 11, her fame had transcended national borders. Television networks in Europe and Asia requested appearances, magazines clamored for interviews, and her recordings sold in quantities that seemed impossible for a child of her age. Yet with every accolade, the shadow over Ashwood Hollow grew heavier. The town, once lively and quaint, now seemed suffused with a subtle dread, as though the very air had thickened with unease. At the studio, strange phenomena intensified. Microphones captured faint whispers in languages no one could identify. Spotlights flickered without explanation, and cameras malfunctioned during her most flawless performances. Crew members spoke of a cold presence in the room, an oppressive feeling that would ease only when Lila left. One lighting technician described how the shadows seemed to cling to her as she moved, stretching unnaturally along walls and floors, bending around her as if the very light itself feared her. Lila herself remained calm, eerily composed. She was polite and articulate, never demanding attention yet somehow commanding it completely. She spent hours observing, noting small gestures, subtle facial expressions, and minute reactions in anyone who crossed her path. Occasionally, she would tilt her head and smile faintly, a smile that seemed far too knowing for a child. During a rehearsal for a live television event, she approached a sound engineer quietly. "Do you feel it too?" as she asked, her voice low, almost a whisper. "Are the things that wait just beyond what we see?" The man laughed nervously, dismissing it as a child's curiosity. Yet later that night, he awoke to the sensation of someone watching him from the foot of his bed. He swore he saw a small silhouette, impossibly still, humming a melody that he could not place. By morning, the feeling lingered, a cold weight pressing against his chest. In Ashwood Hollow, the townspeople's unease grew. Small businesses continued to close, longtime residents fell ill or disappeared, and the central square became almost entirely deserted. The older residents whispered of ancient prophecies, tales of children born under extraordinary circumstances carrying within them forces older than the town itself. Margaret Hawthorne, increasingly fragile, attempted to shield Lila from this mounting darkness. She forbade nighttime wanderings, covered mirrors, and locked doors. Yet objects still shifted, shadows still moved, and the faint, untraceable laughter of children echoed through the halls. Margaret's prayers in Latin, whispered fervently each night, seemed only to slightly delay the inevitable. Meanwhile, Lila's international fame soared. She appeared on talk shows, performed at large arenas, and received awards she was barely old enough to understand. Critics were unanimous in their praise, describing her as a child prodigy of unparalleled skill. Yet those who worked with her closely often noticed subtle, disquieting changes. A minor injury on a stagehand healed too quickly to be natural. A microphone that had short-circuited during rehearsal returned to perfect function minutes later, seemingly unaffected. Fans outside Ashwood Hollow began reporting eerie experiences. A girl in London wrote about waking to find Lila standing silently in her bedroom, her voice humming an indecipherable tune. A boy in Tokyo claimed that recordings of her songs seemed to shift subtly during the night, the harmonies layered with faint, unearthly whispers. Publicly, these accounts were dismissed as fantasy. Privately, they spread among those who had dared to look beyond the dazzling public image. Lila's personal life remained equally unsettling. She rarely played with other children and did not ask for toys. When forced into small groups, she observed silently, occasionally tilting her head and whispering things far beyond her age. Teachers and staff noted that she seemed to read a people, understanding them in ways that were impossible for a child. Her gaze carried a weight, a silent knowledge, and those who met it often found themselves unnerved for days. Even Eleanor, her mother, could not escape the growing unease. She remained reclusive, attempting to shield her daughter and herself from the phenomena that seemed drawn to Lila. She whispered prayers, locked doors, and covered mirrors, yet the shadows and sounds persisted. Every night, she felt the cold presence of something unseen pressing close, a constant reminder that her daughter's gift was not only extraordinary but terrifyingly dangerous. By the end of this year, it was clear that Lila Hawthorne was no ordinary child. Her talent, her charm, and her fame were undeniable. But beneath the surface, a growing darkness coiled, one that stretched far beyond Ashwood Hollow, one that threatened not just a town, but anyone who came too close to her radiant, yet terrifying presence. No one, not the public, not the crew, not even her mother, could foresee the full scope of what Lila carried within her. The innocence they adored masked a force ancient and relentless, one that would soon demand acknowledgement. At 12, Lila Hawthorne's fame reached an almost mythic level. She was no longer just a child prodigy, she had become a global phenomenon. Every concert hall, television studio, and live broadcast seemed to vibrate with her presence. Her performances were mesmerizing, her voice transcendent, and yet something in the energy surrounding her began to unsettle even the most hardened professionals. Back in Ashwood Hollow, the town's decline accelerated. Windows were found broken with no sign of entry, shadows moved against the flow of natural light, and stray animals were discovered huddled in corners, staring silently as if aware of some unseen threat. People spoke quietly of the child with the eyes of midnight, a girl whose gaze could pierce the soul and reveal hidden fears. Some claimed that after meeting her eyes directly, they experienced strange visions, fleeting glimpses of forests that seemed alive, faces of children who had never existed, and faint whispers that carried warnings in languages they did not recognize. At the studios, Lila's calm demeanor became almost unnerving. She would arrive early, sit silently in her dressing room, and watch the crew as though taking inventory of every movement. Often, she would hum songs not yet written, melodies that made grown men shiver without understanding why. During rehearsals, spotlights would dim precisely when her gaze swept across the stage. Microphones picked up faint harmonies that had no origin, and cameras occasionally captured shadows that shifted unnaturally, independent of any light source. Producers continued to capitalize on her talent, ignoring the whispers of unease. Interviews described her as poised, mature beyond her years, and perfectly composed. Yet the tension backstage grew palpable. One assistant recalled, trembling, how Lila had asked him in a low, deliberate tone, "Do you know what happens to those who stare too long?" He laughed nervously, dismissing it as a child's strange imagination. That night, he dreamed of 1,000 pairs of eyes staring at him in darkness, their collective gaze suffocating and cold. He awoke with a pounding heart, certain that something unseen had followed him home. Eleanor Hawthorne's isolation became more pronounced. She rarely accompanied Lila on her international tours, citing health issues, yet she continued to attempt protective rituals at home. Latin prayers whispered before dawn, small charms placed in every room, mirrors covered with cloth, nothing seemed to keep the growing darkness at bay. One night, she awoke to find her daughter standing silently in the hallway, eyes glimmering in the dim moonlight, whispering a melody that made the hairs on Eleanor's arms rise. Meanwhile, Lila's music began to affect listeners in peculiar ways. Fans reported experiencing vivid, sometimes disturbing dreams after hearing her songs, visions of forgotten forests, shadowed children, and fleeting glimpses of unknown realms. Some claimed the songs carried a hypnotic undertone, drawing listeners into a trance-like state. Musicians who collaborated with her spoke of instruments tuning themselves erratically, as if responding to her internal rhythm rather than the physical notes being played. Even as her fame soared, the town of Ashwood Hollow seemed to drain of life. The central square was deserted more often than not, longtime families vanished without explanation, small businesses shuttered overnight. Those who remained whispered that Lila's rising star was feeding something ancient and powerful, a force that drew sustenance from both admiration and fear. Lila herself remained unfazed by the turmoil. She treated the world like a stage, each person a character in a story only she fully understood. At times, she would speak in a voice far older than her years, murmuring lines that no one could quite comprehend. Crew members occasionally caught her staring at them silently for minutes on end, her gaze unwavering, as if cataloging every secret they had ever tried to hide. Despite all this, the public adored her. Parents proudly showcased her recordings, children copied her mannerisms, and media outlets praised her every movement. She was angelic, talented, and untouchable, yet those who watched too closely could sense the darkness coiled beneath the surface. It was subtle at first, a barely perceptible chill, a feeling that something ancient and hungry lingered just beyond perception. By the end of the year, Lila Hawthorne was no longer just a child star. She had become a symbol, an enigmatic figure whose presence carried both awe and terror. Those in Ashwood Hollow knew the truth. The angelic mask she wore concealed a force that was older, darker, and far more dangerous than anyone could imagine. And though the world celebrated her, a silent reckoning loomed, waiting for the day when the shadows she carried would demand their due. By the time Lila Hawthorne turned 13, the world had become both her stage and her instrument. Concert halls, television studios, and live broadcasts seemed to hum with an energy that followed her everywhere. Her performances were flawless, her presence magnetic, yet the air around her carried a subtle, unnerving tension. Crew members, fans, and even family could sense it, an invisible pressure that grew heavier with each passing day. Ashwood Hollow continued its slow decay. Streets once bustling with life were now eerily silent at dusk. Pets and stray animals huddled in corners, eyes wide with fear, refusing to enter certain rooms. Windows shattered spontaneously, doors would lock themselves, and faint, mournful songs echoed through empty buildings. The older residents spoke in whispers about an ancient prophecy, a child born under extraordinary circumstances carrying a force older than memory, destined to awaken it fully one day. Within studios, Lila Zora became more pronounced. Lights flickered when she entered, shadows stretched and twisted along walls, and microphones sometimes picked up soft choruses that had no discernible source. Cameras occasionally recorded moments when she wasn't even in the frame, yet her figure appeared nonetheless, silent and observing. Crew members reported feeling a weight on their chests, as though unseen hands were pressing down, compelling them to maintain eye contact with her. Lila herself remained composed, almost unnaturally so. She spent hours observing, noting subtle expressions, slight changes in posture, and unspoken emotions in everyone she encountered. Occasionally, she would tilt her head and smile faintly, a knowing smile that suggested a depth of understanding far beyond her age. During one particularly tense rehearsal, she approached a sound engineer quietly and asked, "Do you hear them? The ones who watch when no one else is looking?" The man laughed nervously, dismissing it as the strange imagination of a child. That night, he dreamed of countless eyes staring at him from the darkness, their gaze suffocating and cold. When he awoke, he felt a lingering presence, as if the shadow of Lila's influence had followed him home. At home, Eleanor Hawthorne's efforts to protect her daughter grew increasingly desperate. She whispered Latin prayers before dawn, covered mirrors, and locked doors. Yet shadows moved independently of light, objects shifted inexplicably, and faint laughter echoed through the hallways. One night, she awoke to find Lila standing silently in the moonlit corridor, her eyes glimmering, humming a melody that sent shivers down Eleanor's spine. Meanwhile, Lila's international performances amplified her influence. Audiences were captivated, critics were spellbound, and media outlets celebrated her every move. But subtle disturbances persisted, instruments tuned themselves strangely, recordings contained faint ghostly harmonies, and stage lights occasionally dimmed without reason. Fans reported unusual experiences, vivid dreams, fleeting visions of shadowed forests, whispers that seemed to layer themselves over her songs. Even off-stage, Lila's behavior unnerved those around her. She avoided other children, rarely requested toys, and spoke in tones far older than her years. Teachers and staff noted that she seemed to understand people on an uncanny level, reading their fears and desires with ease. Those who met her gaze often felt drained, unsettled, and sometimes haunted for days afterward. As her fame and power grew, the town of Ashwood Hollow continued to deteriorate. Businesses closed, longtime families disappeared, and the once lively central square remained desolate. Older residents whispered that Lila was feeding an ancient force, a darkness older than the town itself. Her rise was no longer just a matter of talent, it was a slow awakening of something primordial and malevolent. By the end of the year, Lila Hawthorne had become more than a child star. She was a symbol, an enigma, a figure whose innocence masked a force of unimaginable depth. The world celebrated her brilliance, yet those attuned to her presence understood the truth. One day, the shadow she carried would demand its reckoning. By 14, Lila Hawthorne had become a living legend, a prodigy whose every movement captivated millions. Yet with each performance, the darkness surrounding her deepened, and Ashwood Hollow seemed to wither in response. Streets were quieter than ever, with windows that rattled for no reason and shadows that shifted independently of the light. Pets fled from rooms where Lila had recently been, and a strange, unplaceable hum lingered in the air, almost like the echoes of unseen voices. Inside studios, the phenomena intensified. Cameras occasionally captured ghostly silhouettes behind her, lights flickered without explanation, and microphones recorded whispers that did not originate from any human mouth. Crew members began to feel a subtle, oppressive pressure in her presence, as though their very thoughts were being weighed and measured. One makeup artist recounted, trembling, how Lila had leaned close during a quiet moment and asked, "Have you ever wondered how long it takes for a soul to break?" Her tone was calm, almost clinical, yet it left him frozen with fear. He later confessed that the voice seemed older than her years, imbued with a certainty that chilled him to the bone. Meanwhile, Lila's influence over audiences became uncanny. Fans reported feeling drained yet mesmerized after listening to her songs. People who watched her performances described a sense of being observed, as if unseen eyes were scanning their minds while she sang. Dreams became haunted by her presence. Teenagers dreamt of her standing silently in hallways, singing in languages unknown, eyes glinting with something ancient and unrelenting. Ashwood Hollow continued to decay. Longtime families vanished, businesses shuttered, and the central square grew more desolate with each passing week. The older townsfolk whispered that the child's rising fame was feeding a force far older than the town itself, a presence that demanded attention and sustenance. Even the wind seemed to carry a mournful song whenever Lila returned, as if the natural world itself acknowledged her power. At home, Eleanor Hawthorne grew more desperate. She locked doors, covered mirrors, and whispered prayers in Latin, trying to keep the darkness at bay. Yet shadows moved freely, objects shifted on their own, and the faint echo of children's laughter haunted empty corridors. Eleanor sometimes found her daughter standing silently, staring out of windows late at night, humming melodies that made the hairs on her arms rise. Lila herself remained unfazed, almost eerily composed. She observed the world with a depth far beyond her years, noting every fear, every weakness, every secret in those around her. Her interactions were precise, measured, and calculated, yet always innocent in appearance. Staff, co-stars, and fans alike felt simultaneously drawn to and repelled by her presence, caught in the tension between adoration and dread. Even the brightest accolades and awards could not dispel the growing sense of unease. Stage lights dimmed unexpectedly during her performances, instruments would tune themselves without explanation, and the recordings of her songs began to carry faint, ghostly harmonies layered beneath the music. Listeners reported vivid dreams, visions of shadowed forests, fleeting glimpses of children who had never existed, and whispers in languages they could not recognize. And yet, Lila continued to ascend. Each step of her career seemed predestined, almost as if unseen forces were guiding her path. International tours, television appearances, and musical collaborations amplified her influence, spreading both her fame and the subtle weight of the darkness that followed her. By the end of her 14th year, it was clear that Lila Hawthorne was no longer merely a child star. She had become an enigma, a force whose innocence masked a power that had existed long before her birth. Ashwood Hollow, once a vibrant town, was now a quiet, trembling shadow of its former self, aware that the girl they had raised in their midst carried within her something older, something relentless, and something far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. No one, not her mother, not the crew, not even the fans, could yet understand the full scope of what she was. The angelic mask she wore would not last forever, and the world would soon glimpse the ancient malice hidden beneath her flawless exterior. By the age of 15, Lila Hawthorne had become more than a child prodigy. She had become a phenomenon whose influence seemed to reach beyond comprehension. Every performance carried an almost tangible weight, as if the very air responded to her presence. Audiences were captivated, yet subtly unnerved, feeling a pull they could not identify. In homes across continents, fans described dreams haunted by her figure, shadows of her gaze lingering even after the music had stopped. Ashwood Hollow had almost entirely transformed. Streets were silent at dusk, and windows that had once gleamed in the sunlight now reflected only darkness. Pets hid from rooms where Lila had been, and townsfolk reported hearing faint melodies in the wind, melodies they could not recognize, that brought a shiver to their spines. Rumors spread of a child who could command attention not just with her talent but with something far older, a presence so profound that it warped the very reality around her. Within the studios, the strange occurrences intensified. Lights would dim at her approach, cameras occasionally captured her image where she hadn't been, and microphones recorded soft, unplaceable whispers. Crew members spoke of a pressure, a subtle but undeniable sensation that weighed on the chest and mind of anyone who entered her presence. One assistant recalled, with trembling hands, the day Lila quietly asked, "Do you know what happens to those who stare too long into the heart of something eternal?" The man laughed nervously at first, dismissing it as an oddity of a precocious child. But that night, he awoke to the feeling of countless unseen eyes watching him, and he could not shake the oppressive weight that lingered in his bedroom. Even Eleanor Hawthorne, Lila's mother, found her protective measures increasingly inadequate. She whispered prayers in Latin, placed charms around the house, and covered mirrors, yet the shadows moved freely, objects shifted on their own, and the faint sound of children's laughter echoed through the corridors. Eleanor sometimes found Lila standing silently at the window late at night, her eyes glimmering, humming a melody that seemed impossibly ancient. Fans reported more disturbing experiences. A teenager in Berlin wrote of waking to find Lila standing silently at the foot of her bed, singing in a language that seemed both familiar and utterly alien. A young man in Sydney claimed that recordings of her music shifted subtly overnight, revealing faint choruses layered beneath the original tracks, a haunting, hypnotic accompaniment. Publicly, these accounts were ignored or dismissed. Privately, however, they spread among those who had witnessed or sensed the inexplicable power she carried. Despite these unsettling occurrences, her career continued its meteoric rise. Concerts sold out worldwide, television appearances were scheduled months in advance, and awards poured in. Yet beneath the glittering surface, a pattern became undeniable. The more Lila ascended, the more Ashwood Hollow decayed. Shops closed without explanation, longtime residents disappeared, and the central square became eerily silent. The older townsfolk whispered that the girl's presence was feeding an ancient force, one older than the town itself, one that required both fear and admiration to thrive. Even on stage, Lila's aura seemed to affect the environment. Lights dimmed inexplicably during solos, instruments would tune themselves erratically, and subtle harmonies, a faint, ghostly, unplaceable, echoed in recordings. Audiences felt drawn to her, yet a deep, unspoken fear lingered, a primal recognition that the child before them was not entirely human in her influence. Her behavior remained disturbingly calm. She rarely engaged with other children, showing no desire for toys or games, and often observed adults with a silent, piercing gaze that seemed to measure their every thought and intention. Those who looked too long into her eyes reported feeling exposed, as though Lila could see the very core of their being, reading fears and secrets better left hidden. By the end of this year, It was clear to those attuned to her presence, Lila Hawthorne was no ordinary child. She had become a vessel, a living conduit of something older, darker, and profoundly powerful. While the world celebrated her brilliance, Ashwood Hollow lived in quiet dread, aware that the innocence they had once cherished masked a force that could not be contained forever. The stage was set, the mask of innocence firmly in place, but the shadow behind it was growing, patient and inevitable. And all who had eyes to see could sense that the day of revelation, the day the true nature of Lila Hawthorne would emerge, was fast approaching. By 16, Lila Hawthorne had reached the pinnacle of fame, yet the darkness that followed her had grown almost tangible. Every concert hall, television studio, and stage she graced seemed to hum with an unseen presence. Audiences were enchanted, yet an undercurrent of fear flowed through the crowd, imperceptible to the untrained eye but unmistakable to those sensitive to the inexplicable. Ashwood Hollow had become a town suspended in quiet terror. Streets were empty at dusk, windows reflected shadows that moved independently, and the air carried a weight, a subtle vibration that pressed on the chest and mind of anyone who lingered. Residents spoke in hushed tones of the child who carries midnight in her eyes, a girl whose gaze could reveal the deepest fears and unravel hidden truths. Small businesses had vanished, longtime families disappeared, and the central square stood desolate, save for the faint echoes of children's laughter in the wind. At the studios, phenomena escalated. Cameras occasionally captured ghostly figures behind her, lights dimmed and flickered without explanation, and microphones recorded faint, untraceable whispers. Crew members described an oppressive sensation, a feeling of being observed and measured, that persisted even when she was not present. One makeup artist, trembling, recalled the day Lila leaned close and whispered, "Do you know what happens when innocence dies?" The words were calm, yet heavy with certainty. That night, he dreamed of countless shadowed children standing silently in darkened rooms, watching him. When he awoke, the weight remained, a cold reminder of the unseen forces that followed Lila. Even Eleanor Hawthorne, her mother, felt increasingly powerless. Latin prayers, charms, and protective rituals seemed to delay but not stop the encroaching darkness. Lila would sometimes appear at the window late at night, humming melodies that felt impossibly old, her eyes reflecting knowledge no human should possess. Eleanor began to wonder if she had ever truly protected her daughter, or if she had merely delayed the inevitable. Lila's influence extended far beyond Ashwood Hollow. Fans across the globe reported strange experiences, waking to find her standing silently in bedrooms, songs shifting subtly overnight with ghostly harmonies layered beneath, and vivid dreams of shadowed forests and impossible landscapes. Publicly, the world adored her. Privately, those attuned to the supernatural knew the truth. Lila Hawthorne was not merely a prodigy, she was a vessel, a bridge to something ancient, powerful, and relentless. Her interactions with others remained unnervingly calm. She avoided other children, showed little interest in toys, and spoke with a maturity that defied her years. Teachers, staff, and colleagues often felt exposed under her gaze, as though she could peer directly into the hidden chambers of the soul. Those who stared too long reported unease, nausea, and vivid visions that lingered for days. Then came the night that would define everything. It was during a sold-out performance in the largest theater Ashwood Hollow had ever known. Lila's presence was electric, the audience was entranced. As she began her song, shadows gathered at the edges of the stage, moving unnaturally, twisting against the light. A cold wind swept through the hall, extinguishing candles and making the chandeliers sway. Instruments played themselves, and faint, unearthly harmonies resonated, not from the stage, but seemingly from the very walls. As the final note of her song rang out, the mask of innocence finally slipped. Her eyes, dark, fathomless, impossibly ancient, held the audience in a trance. In that moment, the hidden force within her revealed itself fully. Shadows spilled into the theater, shapes of children and faces unknown, all drawn to her, all bound to her will. The air grew thick with a tangible malice, and a low, unearthly hum filled every corner of the hall. Eleanor watched in terror as the daughter she had tried to protect became something unstoppable, something older than the world itself. She whispered prayers desperately, but even the words faltered against the overwhelming power that radiated from Lila. Crew members froze, audiences gasped, and those attuned to the supernatural recognized the truth. Lila Hawthorne was no longer merely a child star. She had become a herald, a living omen, a symbol of innocence transformed into something monstrous, yet irresistibly compelling. When the lights finally returned, Lila stood alone on the stage, smiling faintly, as though nothing had happened. The audience, enthralled and terrified, applauded. And yet, deep in the hearts of those who had glimpsed the shadows, a silent understanding settled. The world had witnessed only the beginning. The child who had been a symbol of purity had fully revealed the ancient darkness within her, and nothing, no prayer, no charm, no mortal intervention, could contain it. Ashwood Hollow would never recover, nor could it. Lila Hawthorne's path had been set, and her influence would ripple across the globe. The innocence the world adored had become a conduit for a power older than time itself, a force that would haunt generations. And those who looked into her eyes knew, in the deepest recesses of their souls, that the true face of Lila Hawthorne had only just emerged. The mask was gone. The child star was no more. What remained was something eternal, something dark, and something that the world would never forget.